A warm welcome to everyone to this fifth session of the UNECE Resource Management Week 2021. A good day to everyone from Geneva. From my side, I am Hari Tulsidas and Charlotte Griffiths here from Geneva. Please note that this session is recorded. The session will have simultaneous interpretation into English, French, and Russian. Please select your channel from the bottom of the menu. All speakers are requested to speak slowly and very clearly so that interpretation could be done with high standards. Participants are requested to provide your comments and questions through the chat box. Please select panelists and all attendees when you are sending out the messages and not just the panelist. So to make sure everyone is getting your comments. You can also provide your comments via email to reserves.energy@un.org. We can put the link on the email address on the chat also. All presentations and recordings will be uploaded to the meeting website. With that, I will hand over the floor to today's chair of the session, Mr. Igor Shupurov, who is the first vice chair of the expert group on resource management. He will be chairing this session, and I request Igor to take on the floor. Igor, please.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm glad to see you, ladies and gentlemen. Я буду говорить по-русски. Я надеюсь, перевод будет хороший и высшего качества. Сегодняшняя сессия будет посвящена тому, как рамочная классификация ООН и система управления ресурсами ООН могут способствовать продвижению к экономике замкнутого цикла в использовании ресурсов. Эта концепция в равной степени применима ко всем ресурсам: твердым полезным ископаемым, углеводородному сырью, ядерному топливу, возобновляемой энергии и подземным водам. Так, цикличность в нефтегазовой отрасли способствует сокращению сжигания на факеле, и различные другие потери, развитие технологий улавливания углеводородов, которые вылетают в атмосферу, использование и хранение углерода и расширение использования метана угольных пластов. Это тоже важно. И хотя с добычей нефти и газа у нас ассоциируется энергетика, примерно треть добываемой продукции используется в других областях, например, агрохимии и производстве пластмасс. А природный газ остается важным сырьем сам по себе, но также в будущем это будет важное сырье для производства водорода. Однако цикличность остается в центре внимания минерального сырья и твердых полезных ископаемых, которое может быть использовано повторно. Это касается, например, техногенных месторождений. Технические условия рамочной классификации ООН, касающиеся техногенных и антропогенных ресурсов, будут иметь важное значение, поскольку многие изготовители обращаются к вторичным ресурсам, или как у нас называют техногенные ресурсы, как к варианту, который в некоторых случаях является предпочтительным. Система управления ресурсами ООН – это динамическое продолжение рамочной классификации, и в нем делается попытка объединить подходы к управлению ресурсами, которые существуют у разных стран и в разных классификациях. Комплексное и единое управление ресурсами позволит свести к минимуму отходы и повысить эффективность ресурсов. Ресурсы, не отправленные в отходы, это, по сути, новые ресурсы или воспроизведенные ресурсы. При таком подходе мы можем уйти от парадигмы нехватки ресурсов и вступить в новую эру изобилия ресурсов. И, конечно, также система управления ресурсами может позволить нам по-новому взглянуть на систему привлечения инвестиций для разведки и добычи полезных ископаемых и ресурсов, начиная от ископаемых ресурсов и заканчивая возобновляемыми и антропогенными ресурсами. О некоторых аспектах всех этих процессов нам расскажут известные эксперты, которые сегодня присутствуют на нашем заседании. И я бы хотел перейти к нашей программе и представить этих экспертов. И первым из них будет Тереза Понсе-де-Лян, председатель подгруппы EGRM по системе управления ресурсов. Пожалуйста, Тереза.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can I share my presentation?
Yes,
Okay.
please go ahead.
I'll start
Teresa.
sharing. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair, again for the introduction and a good day to you all. So it's my role today to tell you the state of the art of the United Nations Resource Management System. We saw that the United Nations Framework Classification has gained maturity. It's necessary, but is not enough to evaluate projects. So we proceeded with the development of a companion tool, the United Nations Resource Management Systems, which is under development. This tool is a comprehensive one to evaluate sustainability of projects regarding resource management systems and intends to support the implementation of 2030 agenda. It's a voluntary global standard for systemic integrated analysis tool, and it's very much inspired in former works and studies. And you have here the list of all the documents that were analyzed and included in the work. So it's expected that this tool will be widely used by resource management stakeholders across all sectors and jurisdictions. And you can see that the primary stakeholders are governments, regional bodies, the industry, the investors and financial regulators, the academia, non-profit institutions, indigenous communities, and the public. So it's a matter of being able to decide among different projects regarding based on social, environmental, and economical criteria. And here you can see that between two or more ways to move on the investments, we will be able to compare and to decide what's better for people, for planet, and for economic development. It was, as I already told, built on the strengths of the UNFC, and it's a communicating tool with UNFC. As I already told, UNFC intends to be able to account the resources based on the maturity of projects, and it is already a mature approach. UNRMS will come now, and we are developing it. It will be a system for integrated and sustainable management of resources. The 2030 Agenda and Paris Agreement enumerated the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and this will be all included in this tool. We envisage that this tool will lead us to a direction regarding the evaluation of sustainable development goals and impacts on each one of them. It's a tool that intends to reach a goal and is not a rate of progress. The Sustainable Development Goal call for integrated systemic management development of resources. The Sustainable Development Goals need long-term approaches so that we can evaluate the impact in the future of what we are deciding and doing today. It will benefit the present but also the future generations. The structure of this tool will include fundamental principles and requires a resource management for sustainable development. It will also include the data standards, so much talk yesterday. So standards are very important, and data also, good data and standardized data. It will develop the guidelines for analysis and decision making. So it will be it will be brought to the stakeholders so that they can take good decisions, and the government, it's so important for the governments. For sustainable resource management to be holistic, to respond to the complexity and attending the life cycle. And so it will be, attending in the life cycle approach, it will be based on principles. So here we have the fundamental principles, a provisional view. Its comments and inputs are welcome. So here I listed the 11 principles: state rights and responsibilities in the management of resources, responsibility to the planet, integrated and indivisible management of resources, social contract on natural resources, service orientation, comprehensive resource recovery, circularity, health and safety, innovation, transparency, and continuous strengthening of core competencies and capabilities. These are in our document further elaborated, of course. The guidelines provide additional information on specific activities that are part of the overall sustainable resource management. A partial and provisional list of topics I include here: sustainability reporting, financial reporting, resource project classification, resource management and reporting, readiness assessment, technology prospecting, and valuation workflow, tangible and intangible assets. So we already developed a timeline plan of work with deliverables and timelines. And here we will send out a stakeholder survey during May. The UNRMS principles, structure and guidelines will see the final version for publication 15 June 2021. The terms of reference of UNRMS phase 1 with case studies in 30 June 2021. The beginning of case studies by International Centers of Excellence, Sustainability Resource Management by 15 July 2021. The requirements for draft EGRM 12 by 15 December 2021, terms of reference for phase 2 case studies by 15 January 2022, initiation of phase 2 case studies by February 2022, and the finalization of UNRMS will take place in 2022 with revised principles, with the structure and guidelines by December 2022. We also have foreseen some workshops. The first one on the 3rd June this year, 2nd September this year, and the third stakeholder workshop on the 4th November 2021. The session with the showcase studies will take place in April 2022. The expected participants are all EGRM working groups members and the International Centers of Excellence, Sustainable Resource Management stakeholders, and other. So these are some intended dates for our planned meetings. And just to end my presentation, what will UNRMS provide to help decision makers? Will be based on scenarios, explain the content and nature, principles, concepts, and terminology, a framework and with specifications, data standards and guidelines for analysis, guidance tools that will provide UNRMS on a programmatic project and asset scales. To note, UNFC provides information about current status and allows analysis of policy changes on projects, assets, and entities and jurisdictions. But UNRMS will provide the requirements for future decision in an integrated and systemic view in a long-term basis. Thank you for listening, and it's all from my side. And happy to answer
Спасибо большое, Тереза. Было действительно очень интересно. Мы увидели сроки завершения работ, что тоже важно. Надеюсь, что мы в них впишемся. Следующий докладчик – это председатель рабочей группы GRM по достижению целей устойчивого развития Джулиан Хилтон. Джулиан расскажет о системе управления ресурсами как инструменте для перехода к экономике замкнутого цикла. Джулиан, вы готовы?
Can you stop Teresa's presentation and allow Julian to stream?
Sorry.
Can you see and hear now?
Yes, we can see and hear. Thank you, Julian.
Well, greetings from London to wherever you are in the world tuning into this very important meeting, and thank you for listening to my presentation. I'm going to be talking about redefining resource management as a public good, and I'm going to try to do that in 12 to 15 minutes. I see this change in focus as a fundamental part of the transition towards a circular economy, which is changing the way we think, not just changing the way we act. This does not come from nowhere. In April 2017, the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Europe welcomed the participants to the meeting and drew attention to the importance of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the key challenges in attaining it. He noted the change the narrative on resources from one of unbalanced production, which leaves behind significant externalities. Those are costs that are imposed on future generations they never asked for, to one where more value will be created. The most evident example of this as tailings and residues left behind by extractive industries. On the assumption global population will reach 9.6 billion by 2050, the equivalent of almost 3 planet Earths could be required to provide the natural resources needed to sustain current lifestyles with current consumption patterns. We have, unless you've not noticed, only one very fragile planet Earth. He noted further with appreciation the work undertaken to broaden the application of the UNFC, Framework Classification for Resources, including renewable energy, as well as the development of bridging documents. As a mark of how quickly we have changed, it now deals with all natural resources, not just a few. In closing, he underlined the importance of the work being undertaken on resource classification and the value of UNFC as a public good. The link is given there to the speech. So now I'm going to invoke the history of Geneva as a center of reform in Europe in the 16th century, the Reformation it was called. This was a transformation that is still shaping modern Geneva today, the rest of Europe today. And I think we are at an equivalent junction point. And this Reformation was set off by somebody in Germany, Martin Luther, nailing theses to the wall, to the door, sorry, of one of the churches in Wittenberg in Germany. And the thesis in those days was rather like one of these meetings. What do we think about what we might need to do next? So these are the 7 theses that I'm offering to nail on the virtual portal of the Palais des Nations. Extractive industries and the linear economy are at the highly conflicted junction point between public good as a commodity to service or service to society as a whole, and public good as a business run without profit. Can these two survive? Can a business be not profitable, but perhaps in surplus, and at the same time provide equal service to everyone, not just the people who've invested in it, who are shareholders? Is that then the reason why extractive industries have become so unpopular, even to the point of civil unrest or conflict? Is that a social license to operate, to recover and reduce resources critical to all of us is no longer enough? The public has to be a prime stakeholder in resource management, and in this capacity, enjoy equal access to what we all equally need. This is what Maslow, the famous American social anthropologist and psychologist, calls the hierarchy of needs. To put it bluntly, the linear model of extractive industries is broken. It is also deeply tarnished by its associations with colonialism and slavery, issues which have now only very recently during the COVID pandemic really come out. Stakeholder capitalism, the new movement initiated out of the United States in particular, but also Geneva and Davos, understands this, as does environmental, social, and governance, so-called ESG finance. So my argument at the EC Roundtable of January 21 of this year was a new social resource contract based on the John Nash equilibrium. He's the Nobel Prize winning economist. Equivalent of interest has to be renegotiated. It will be based on redefining public good to be the point of convergence between stakeholder capitalism and meeting the essential needs of all, notably for access to water, energy, and food security as a public good. You could put it another way, as a human right. As a result, the economic transformation to circularity will be in effect to fuse 2 value systems in the linear resource economy to those of money and molecules, both the currencies, both involve the flow of materials or funds, into one single currency where money is heads and molecules are tails. The same coin has 2 faces. That is where the UN system of resource management has a critical role to play. Here is John Nash. And my suggestion is this the time? Is Geneva, is this the time and place for a resource reformation? Where apter than Geneva to do this? John Nash is famous for his equilibrium theory when he argues in what's called a non-cooperative game, the opposite parties argue each other almost to a standstill. And when whatever's left in agreement, that agreement will stand. That's the principle of selfish negotiation. It arrives at the stable equilibrium point. So here is what the route looks like as we go forward. This is a schematic that shows approximately what happens when we move from the linear economy to a reuse economy, which is where we are, I think, now, recycling and reuse, to a truly circular economy. Here we are in April 2021. We still will need and have to develop further innovative technologies. The standard technologies are aligned to linearity. We need research and development and market levers to get to the reuse economy, which we've been doing for the last 5 to 10 years. That will optimize where we can get to on a linear basis, but it will not transform into circularity. So we need further R&D, very significant quantities of it, because this also includes issues such as climate action and biodiversity protection, which are missing from the agenda at the moment. That way, we start to progress, but it requires disruptions, and there are plenty of them, as we know at the moment, almost popping up and making billionaires in the process every day. Materials flows are fundamental to this. We have to be able to track these flows, understand what they are, and try in some cases to reroute the destination. In the colonial model, linear flows is exactly what happens. They move from one continent, particularly Africa, South America, to Europe or the North America, and they don't go back. That process has to be rethought. How do these materials flows also flow back when needed? That means the outputs and the outcomes are different. In linearity, we're dealing with waste designed in. There is an assumption we make something, use it and throw it away. The landfills around London are filled up as a result of that proposition. Now we recognize we have to reduce and recover, but that's not enough. We need to get to hard to do. People on hardline laws of thermodynamics and physics will say it's not possible. Within reasonable limits, we must get to zero waste. That, I think, is the basis of the social resource contract. That's where we align to the just transition, as it's called, for the energy. But this covers all approaches to all resources. The just transition begins with the principle of materiality in investment. When we look at all factors in making an investment, see what would be material to our risk. We then look at the focuses on investors, but that's where stakeholder capitalism has come in to change the game. It is no longer the investor top of the list, it's the stakeholder. So yes, we maintain investor return. We look at the social license to operate. We think about sustainable development, what was also called by John Elkington in 1992, a triple bottom line, environmental, social, and economic return. And we have to eliminate these negative externalities from residues and tailings. But that too is not enough. The European Commission has therefore introduced the concept of double materiality. What is both the hard economic realities of our decision, but what are the social and environmental consequences of those decisions? And can those be brought into alignment, so-called double materiality? That way, I think we are fully aligned with the Nash equilibrium model, what we've learned to call the win-win investor equilibrium, where both the investor and the stakeholder, that's all of us, the whole planet population, feels they have a stake in and a return from participation in this process. Resilience is an outcome. If we've learned one thing from COVID, which all the centuries, I suspect up to the 20th in the North had realized was the key anyway, which is how do we deal with these crises, which were permanent states of affairs until perhaps the beginning of public health and sewerage systems in cities. We then have to move the externalities internally and have value creation as internalities. The industrial ecosystem has to diversify. And as a result of that, we arrive at what the UN Sustainable Development Goals so elegantly summarize: people, planet, and prosperity for all. But as the Gates Foundation in its Goalkeeper report made very clear not very long ago, we've gone back 25 years in the sustainable development process in a matter of 25 weeks. Signs of economic recovery in some countries are very good, but universally not the case. So we're now thinking of building back better. And what does that better depend on? In my view, it depends on a new point of equilibrium, which is going to be enshrined in the social resource contract. That is the new fulcrum point for the future. That is the end of my presentation. I've given here the link for the concept paper, in which all of the ideas that I've been outlining today have been published for comment. I would strongly encourage participants in this meeting and those who you reach through your social media or other forms of communication, please comment, please argue with us, please contest what we're saying, please debate. This is an open discussion, and what we've set out is deliberately provocative, thought-provoking, but we hope not in any sense misleading or misguided, because these are fundamental decisions in which we all have not just a stake, but if we do not exercise our duty, in my view, it's our duty to voice our opinions, express them in a kind, favorable and thoughtful way with each other, and respect what we hear back, which may not be always what we want to hear, it is what we need to listen to with great respect. We very much encourage, and where better than the UN and Geneva to be hosting virtually that wonderful conversation, which I'm very proud to be part of. Thank you all for listening, and back to you, Harry.
Джулиан, спасибо большое за ваш доклад. Он был очень интересный. И дальше по набору инструментов мы послушаем по РК ООН, мы послушаем Ян Хуа, заместитель директора Центра зарубежных исследований компании SONDC Китай. Ян Хуа, на связи?
Could you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Chair Igor. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today is our great honor for Mr. Li Jiang, and me on behalf of the China delegation to introduce our recent achievements on the UNFC and UNMS toolkits. Firstly, I would like to remind that the resources management is a complicated systematic engineering for UNFC UNMS, serving as a unifying global resources management standard for 2030 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. A powerful UNFC code basis digital tool is very important, essential for UNFC and UNMS evergreen development and practical application. So last year, under Mr. Ju Jianhua's leadership, my team started to develop the UNFC and UNMS toolkit. And this job is targeted to provide a powerful data center, smart platform, and CC network for both China and global AGR members to meet our great vision. So let's go through this introduction slides very briefly as the first time. So to the data center, its scope covers the RMS codes and the KI key index system, UNFC documents, case studies, pioneer test for the UNRMS, and data convergence from the public organizations, and the mining, sharing, supporting, and other invaluable services such as the training, dissemination. Based on the database above and the needing by the emerging specialization, emerging infrastructure, and emerging production enabler, we can establish a smart platform of work to support our integrated resources management activities. Of course, given the database and smart platform, we also need a CC network to promote international cooperation and collaboration to follow on the following activities, in particular enabling the global recovery from the COVID-19. Here shows the very general roadmap of the tools we can from the data convergence to establish the Lexus system here, and also serving the applications policy and also the training, counting, financing, and investment. So that's here, just like the approach mentioned by the Hunian just now. Here shows the main functions we have already developed here. Let's choose one case study, for example, to give an introduction about the tool functions. Firstly, we start the toolkit and open the application here, and we can input, that's the application, right, of the BD, right? So we input the basic data and information for the estimate, for example, Chinese system, our case studies. And then we identify the specific mapping scheme and scenarios for the specific cases with our UNECE codes. And finally, we can use our very useful 3D tools to display and analysis all the estimate and supporting our integrated study and reporting. In the end, I appreciate the opportunity to show you 3D tools. So as I introduced above, we also have developed some other models, for example, the models for standard management, and also the bridging document management, and all the document related ERM group. Finally, I introduced briefly our planning. In summary, the UNFC and UNRS toolkit will be developed to align with the 5-point UN action plan, especially including a new social contract to operate, sustainable and integrated management of resources with food, water, and energy nexus perspective. Also, ESG focus investment, innovative models, and also a new style strategy in environmental assessment. So those are the key use to guide our next step. Here, that's a key point for our next step. We will making our efforts to further improve the toolkit. We already have a very good beginning. That's a half success in BTC in China. We have confidence to go on to that. Also, extensive cooperation with the EJAM working group, especially the TAG, the SDG delivery groups and others, and disciplining UFC, UNRMS knowledge, and also apply sustainable resource management approach, especially introduced by Hunian in our practice. Practice that means the environable. We will also actively support the global cooperation and collaboration, because we need to make an effort together to support our 2030 sustainable goals. In a word, we'll do our best and do what we can do. In closing, I want to say we are still on the way, but we expect your participation and contribution. Please let me have a couple seconds to show the 3D tool. Yeah, so actually we know UNECE is figured with a 3D numerical codes. That's very helpful for all the country, all the group, all the experts in the world. So if we develop based on the code, that's very helpful to manage those numbers and the information. So that's all for today. Thank you very much for your listening. I'm open for the question. Thank you, Igor.
Спасибо большое, Янхуа. Мне кажется, было бы интересно, но вообще это тема для отдельного, мне кажется, семинара. Поэтому, может быть, стоит это рассмотреть еще подробнее, потому что это действительно интересно. Дальше мы поговорим об антропогенных ресурсах и экономике замкнутого цикла. И здесь у нас модератор Ульрих Крау. Правильно, Харри, да? У нас... Харри? Харри, меня слышно?
Yeah, yes, Ulrich will be coming online. Just a moment.
Хорошо. Спасибо.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead. Ulrich.
Okay, very nice. Nice greetings from Vienna, the capital of Austria in Europe. It's my pleasure to welcome you to next 70 minutes of interesting talks. The session is called Anthropogenic Resources and Circular Economy. In the next 70 minutes, there will be 6 presentations in total. And this is just the overview on these 6 presentations. The first talk will be an update on the EGRM Anthropogenic Resource Working Group activities. The second talk will be at the presentation of a paper that has recently been published in the Journal of Cleaner Production. It's about resource classification in the context of circular economy. So what's the contribution, what's the benefit, where are the challenges? The third talk, it's a very interesting talk because it reviews about 70 case studies in the mining sector. It focuses on mining and metallurgical residues and provides review results of these case studies. The fourth case study will be, at least to my knowledge, the first application of UNFC to a mining tailings project, which is quite nice. It was done by Rudolf Suppes, and the tailings are located in Portugal. The fifth presentation is to screen and collect data of mining residues in a very early stage of resource recovery. So Ms. Soraya Heuss-Aspichler from UNECE will present an approach which is fully aligned with UNFC. And the last talk by Carlo Cormio from Italy will be the presentation on a new project proposal. It will be submitted to an European funding call. It's Advanced Resource Exploration and Assessment Solutions, briefly called AREAS. So let me come to the first presentation, which is an update on the Anthropogenic Resource Working Group activities. Let me see if this works. Okay, no. Right, let's go ahead. Okay, it's my pleasure to provide an update on the EGRM Anthropogenic Resource Working Group activities. I've prepared three major points for you today. The first point addresses the appointment of the working group chair and the members for the next period. The second point is the working group engagements. There are three subsections on this. The first one is the engagement in the European expert network mining the European anthroposphere. The second is to update the specifications to apply UNFC to anthropogenic resources. The idea behind these activities to harmonize the different commodity specific specifications and to enable comparable results of the UNFC. I don't go into detail during this presentation because there will be a report from the technical advisory group and by its chair, Alistair Jones. And the third one is that the working group was engaged in consulting a consortium for an European funding call. It's an upskilling project and to provide a tool for the assessment and classification of mining residues, which will be fully aligned with the UNFC. The third point is that the working group was engaged in UNFC related dissemination activities. There are three research papers that have been published last year, all dealing with UNFC, and some of them will be presented in separate presentations later on. There were two conference presentations. It was international conferences on resource recovery and two webinars mainly organized by the UNECE. Let's come to the first point. The work of the EGRM Anthropogenic Resource Working Group is mandated by the UNECE is regulated in so-called terms of reference. If you're interested in the scope of the working group, please have a look on this online document. It also includes the appointment of the chair for the next 2 years, so for 2021 to 23. And in April 21, we had a nomination phase, and the acceptance by the nominated candidates is still ongoing. The working group members also confirmed the participation for the next working period. And it's my pleasure to announce that we have a new member. It's Mr. Helmut Rechberger, who is Professor for Resource Management and TU Wien. And in his latest work, he was dealing with the quality of recyclables. On this slide, you see the 14 members of the Anthropogenic Resource Working Group for the next working period. It's quite diverse in Europe, let's just say, ranging from Italy to Norway to Hungary, Austria, Sweden, and Germany, Switzerland, and so on. And we have participants mainly from universities, but also from environment agencies, private consultancies, and the European Research Center. The working group is still reaching out for new members, and I truly believe that we're setting up a policy in the coming working period in order to explore for future competences and also to diversify the number of people around the globe, for instance, to include people from Asia, from Australia, America, South America, and Africa. Let's come to the second point of my presentation. I presented on top you see a timeline from 2015 and to now, to today, to 2021, and it starts on the left-hand side where you can see that the first case studies that applied UNFC to anthropogenic resources were done about 6 years ago by Andrea Winterstedt in 2015. And at the beginning of 2016, a pan-European network called Mining the European Anthroposphere was established. It was funded by the European Coast Association with support of the Horizon 2020 program. And it included about 180 experts from 30 countries. And the focus of this network was the assessment and classification of anthropogenic resources and how to align the communication of recoverable quantities with the UNFC. The network is still finished, let's just say, so the funding period ended. But the interesting point is that both this European, pan-European network with its 180 members, as well as representatives from the European Commission, suggested to install a working group on anthropogenic resources at the UNECE level. And I greatly remember the welcome of the EGRM in 2016 in order to introduce anthropogenic resources and the recovery of materials from residues within the SDG framework of the UNECE. So the working group was established about 5 years ago and was tasked to develop specifications to apply the UNFC to anthropogenic resources in order to have comparable estimates on recoverable quantities from primary sources and from secondary raw material sources. So these specifications were published in 2018. And as the working group members of the anthropogenic resource working group were heavily engaged in this MINEA project, I just want to highlight the two results, the two key results of this expert network. The first one is a report on anthropogenic resource assessment, because UNFC is a standard to communicate the recoverable quantities from exploration to the production of quantities. And in order to fill UNFC with life, you need to assess the resources from a technical point of view, from an environmental point of view, from an economic point of view. And in order to make this assessment, we map the current knowledge levels, gaps, and needs for the assessments in order to determine the recoverable quantities. The second objective of this report is to review case studies that demonstrate this linkage between the resource assessment and the resource classification. The report is available online. Feel free to download and have a look on it. I just want to highlight one outcome of this report. It focuses on the case studies. This report reviews about 50 case studies that are all public accessible and dealing with material recovery from anthropogenic resources. The vast majority of case studies were found for extractive industry residues, which is here the bottom line. But there are also case studies available for material recovery from traditional landfills and from post-consumer residues. So each dot on this figure represents a case study. And the color of these bubbles or circles represent the type of classification code. Yeah, the black one stands for the UNFC, the green one from the McKelvey box, the gray one, the authors used a methodology that is currently not standardized but valuable to think of, and the orange ones are the traditional codes which are used for classification, also for reporting. It's the JORC code or the Canadian standard 43-101. And what you can see here is that the assessments and classifications in the extractive industry are mainly based on the established standards, JORC, Canadian standard, and so on. Of course, these numbers can be converted in the UNFC, but currently they are only done with JORC and the National Instrument 43-101. The only case study we found for UNFC was published by Rudolf Sulpes in last year, and he will elaborate on this case study later on. The other case studies for the post-consumer residues and the landfills either use McKelvey or UNFC. They were mainly done by researchers. And one conclusion of this report is that in the future, we should, sometime unite the community in order to use the UNFC as a single classification tool in order to get comparable estimates, right? The second output of this project was a strategic roadmap on the management of anthropogenic resources. It includes 11 very precise actions that are recommended for implementation, either on national or on European or on global level. The first area of actions is to develop new case studies, pioneering case studies that go beyond the existing ones in order to demonstrate the evolvement and methodologies, in order to go into new fields and to address material streams that have not been subject of UNFC case studies until now. The second action area is to harmonize and develop anthropogenic resource assessment and classification. It means to develop guidelines specific for individual type of residues, for instance, for construction demolition waste, for instance, for tailings, for instance, for waste electronic and equipment, and to establish this linkage between the assessment and the classification. The third point, of course, is to provide information systems. I think a very good example was shown by our Chinese colleague 5 minutes ago. But there are also systems currently maintained by the Joint Research Center from the European Commission in ISPRA. And this can be still extended to include the UNFC numbers into the existing databases. And the fourth point, I think, is very relevant for anthropogenic resources. It's to implement the quality assurance systems. Currently, if reports are done in the mining sector, you need a qualified person who signs the report on the recoverability and who confirms that the classification was done based on best available knowledge and in alignment with the current standards and codes. This is currently not the case for anthropogenic resources, and we recommend to establish such a certification system for institutions, but also for individuals, in order to guarantee the quality of the assessments. And of course, the last point is to establish and support networks like the expert group of resource management, but also the excellent centers on resource management as suggested by the EGRM. Feel free to download and have a look to the report. My final slide, and this is the last one, is about the UNFC related dissemination activities. There was a 2 days conference of the Pan-European Expert Network in Italy. I think it was the last chance to meet personally before the pandemic came over Europe, let's say. So most of the people took the last train back to their home countries before the borders were closed. But it was still a very, very valuable conference where UNFC was presented and linked with the resource assessment of individual waste streams. The second point was a UNECE webinar on the application of UNFC, where we provided guidelines on how to apply the UNFC. And the last point was an international conference of the management of naturally occurring radioactive materials, where UNFC and the application and case studies were presented as well. Yeah, this is my really last slide. I cordially thank the entire working group, also the global network of the expert group of resource management for being so engaged. And I welcome to start next working period for the coming year. Thank you very much.
Добрый день. Следующий у нас докладчик — это Андреа Винтерштегер из Фламандского института технических исследований. Единственная у меня просьба чуть-чуть покороче, и всем следующим докладчикам тоже стараться уложиться в регламент, потому что мы немножко отстаем уже. Спасибо. Андреа, пожалуйста.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you for the introduction. Can you hear me well and see my presentation?
Yes, please go ahead, Andrea.
Yeah, so it's my pleasure to be here. So it's now the 6th year in a row, I think, when we first started to come in 2015 to introduce anthropogenic resources to the platform. Yeah, and today I would like to take the opportunity to present our recent paper on behalf of our co-authors also. Soraya, Julia, Ulrich, Patrick, Mohammed, and Helmut were all part of the working group on anthropogenic resources and/or MINEA. And the title of my presentation is Resource Classification in the Context of Circular Economy, a case study review. So first of all, yeah, why are anthropogenic resources relevant? Here you can see the example of copper. So basically what you can see here, most of the copper that has been mined in the past is today still available in use or hibernating in some products. So yeah, resource anthropogenic stocks are growing over time. And today, yeah, as we can see here from this chart, more copper sits in old landfills, in urban infrastructure, in products than what is currently now known in terms of reserves. So the question here is, are anthropogenic resources the reserves of the future? But yeah, exploiting anthropogenic resources for the circular economy is not straightforward. So there are challenges mainly linked to a lack of knowledge, linked to the resource potential, to the recovery potential, as well as to the utilization potential. So we don't know enough about the quantity. We don't know yet enough about the location of those resources. We don't know enough about the temporal availability of the accessibility, as well as the quality, and not even enough about the composition of waste streams in terms of what kind of products are contained, or what kind of components, what kind of substances, what kind of potential contaminants. And then for the recovery, yeah, we don't know enough about the technical feasibility to recover those resources. Often the organizational infrastructure or the legal framework, they are too weak. It's not clear whether this will be economically viable. It's not clear what are the environmental and social impacts of recovering those anthropogenic resources. And then last but certainly not least, the utilization potential. So there are still a lot of regulatory barriers, health and safety concerns. It's not clear whether resources extracted from waste, from these material stocks, can supply a stable, can provide a stable supply. Also in terms of quality, so sometimes the requirements of manufacturers are different from what recyclers can provide, or there are simply no existing markets. Also, public acceptance is an issue, because often the perception is that these materials are of lower quality, although not necessarily the case. And then these resources need to compete on commodity market with natural resources. So what we did in this recent paper is we reviewed the 14 case studies that classified anthropogenic resources. Ulrich was mentioning them as well. But we focused mainly on peer-reviewed scientific journals, so published in scientific journals. To answer the key questions, how and for what purpose was the classification of anthropogenic resources done in the past in those case studies? And how can resource classification support the transition to a circular economy in the future? And here I'll briefly present some of the results. So what we found is, some of these reviewed case studies classify old landfills, so landfill mining projects. Some of them so resources extracted from e-waste, different types. Some focus on anthropogenic material stocks, so metals in different economies, on built infrastructure, and on waste incineration rescue, so both on bottom and fly ash. So yeah, the resource recovery from material stocks and waste flows was addressed. 10 of these case studies target multiple resources for recovery, so not only one. About half use the UNFC, and the other half uses McKelvey-based classification schemes. 13 of them are forward-looking, and only one is retrospective. 4 of them classify at the project level. So this is, for example, for a landfill mining project. 8 of them at the supranational level. So this is, for example, for air pollution control residues in the European Union and how to extract resources from these residues. 2 at city level. So there an example would be resources contained in the subway network in the city of Vienna. With regard to the motivation of those resource classification in the case studies. So it was about establishing inventories of available and accessible anthropogenic resources at regional and national level. So one example would be to investigate phosphorus stocks in Austria. Another motivation, compare different scenarios for resource recovery projects. So to compare different technology options or to compare different circular economy options. Here an example would be to compare the reuse of permanent magnets in wind turbines to the recycling to metallurgical approaches. Then it was about determining key parameters for the success of a recovery project. So for example, legislation or raw material prices. Here an example would be to when the alternative disposal costs are getting more expensive, then the economics of such a extraction project for waste incineration residues, for example, gets more interesting, economically speaking. Then it was about trying to internalize environmental externalities via concepts of monetization. So here, often the saved greenhouse gas emissions were quantified and then internalized via hypothetical carbon tax. And then, also it was about optimizing waste management operations for enhanced resource recovery at project and system level. So here an example would be on how to optimize the collection of e-waste for an optimal resource recovery in the end. And then, resource classification for a circular economy transition. How could resource classification support the transition to a circular economy? So it can be useful to increase knowledge about available anthropogenic resources. It can support research to develop innovative technologies, innovative processes and methods to enhance the extraction of anthropogenic resources. It can support decision makers with designing new policies and legislation. It helps, obviously, investigate the economic viability of anthropogenic resource extraction, and very importantly, also to include social and environmental externalities. Further, it could improve the uptake of secondary raw materials. It could help to support an integrated resource management, so help to compare anthropogenic resources with natural resources. It can help to improve value chain communication, so to optimize waste management operations, processes, and product designs for enhanced resource recovery. And it can support decision making with respect to different circular economy options. So is it better to go for reuse? Is it better to go for recycling? Or other options. To conclude, key circular economy stakeholders would definitely benefit from a standardized, operationalized anthropogenic resource classification. And here I would like to stress operational, because as we all know, and as already mentioned already, so we have already these specifications under UNFC for anthropogenic resources. But now I think it's time to come up with a guidance on the detailed assessment and to tailor it also for different types of anthropogenic resources. Because as you saw before, they can be very different, right? Whether you talk about resources from landfills, from urban infrastructure, from products, or from waste, although some of you don't like this term, but it's still around. then yeah, and it will help in the end to harmonize data collection on resource potential, recovery potential, and the utilization potential of anthropogenic resources. And it can help to consider individual resource recovery activities as part of a wider system. Yes, thank you very much. Please feel free to ask any questions.
Спасибо большое. Ну, я думаю, что мы подискутируем потом, потому что у нас сейчас времени, к сожалению, нет. И на вопросы тоже. Я думаю, мы у Хари Кришны, у Хари спросим, каким образом, может быть, в чате задавать эти вопросы, да? Для того, чтобы мы не теряли времени сейчас и уложились во время дискуссии. Как вы считаете? Давайте предложим всем в чате задавать вопросы и провести эту дискуссию. Хорошо? Хари? Okay.
Thank you, Igor. That is fine. We will request all participants to put your questions and comments into the chat box, and the speakers to try to answer the chat as much as possible. Thank you. So panelists, please check the chat and provide your answers there. We will try to take up some questions towards the end if there is time. Thank you.
Спасибо. Следующий докладчик – это Карла Кормио, вице-президент и генеральный директор компании Serengeo. И речь будет идти об извлечении минерального сырья из отходов горнодобывающей металлургической промышленности. Пожалуйста, Карла.
Thank you, Igor. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk on this case studies review performed during MINEA cross-section. Okay, so I will briefly provide you an introduction on the work done by the working group 2.1 within MINEA cross-section, objectives and achievement, and the scope of the evidence review I'm going to present. I will describe the method adopted to perform this evidence review and the main results obtained. And then I will conclude with some lesson learned and future works. So concerning MINEA cross-section, which was introduced by Ulrich Krarl, the working group 2.1 dealt with extractive industries residues. The main objectives were to develop a common understanding and definitions regarding material resources and reserves in mining residues deposits, to establish a knowledge base, including technologies and data sources for raw materials recovery from mining residues, and to provide inputs to policymakers on the resource potential in mining residues. The main achievement obtained by the working group were the following three. So we made a survey of national mine waste registries according to the EU directive. 7 European countries were involved: Spain, Portugal, Italy, Slovenia, Hungary, France, and UK. And the analysis was aiming at assessing if these mine waste registries could be used as source of information for the valorization of mine waste deposits. The second achievement was the review of 66 case studies related to raw materials recovery projects in which mining and metallurgical residues were used as a source of minerals or materials. And finally, we collaborated with Working Group 4 in the assessment and classification and reporting of mining and metallurgical residues as resources and reserves. Scope of the evidence review that I'm going to present was to assess the current knowledge, the knowledge gaps, and the actions needed to foster the production of raw materials from mining and metallurgical residues, to analyze case studies providing site-specific information about the characterization, evaluation, and classification for minerals or materials recovery. And we also screened existing projects dealing with exploration, characterization, evaluation, processing, and impact assessment of mining metallurgical residues. The authors were mostly working group members, plus the contribution of Tim Werner from the University of Melbourne, and the support of Soraya Usasbikler and Ulrich Krall. Description of the method. We considered different data sources, so technical reports for investors, reports and databases of research projects dealing, of course, with production of raw materials from mining metallurgical residues, reports from international organizations and research centers, scientific papers, and PhD theses. How and which information did we collect and how did we manage this information? First of all, we collected information about the references. So document type, which is considered relevant because give us a preliminary information about the objectives and the target audience. And the principal, the main document info, so title, authors, geographical coverage, and so on. Concerning the case studies, we collected 3 groups of information: general data, so the raw material source, target materials, location, and maturity level of the project; resource assessment, so the 3 steps from characterization to classification; and the stakeholder perspective, who's the funding body, which were the objectives, and the target audience. We also prepared detailed guidelines to allow experts to add new cases and to update the existing ones. So trying to give a certain quality level to the review. And the work was performed using collaborative tools, mostly Google Sheets and Google Docs, which allowed experts from UK, the European Union, and Australia to collect and review all these case studies. I will briefly tell you that for each information collected, we defined a list of options which the expert could select in the review of the case study. So this was done for raw material source, for instance, waste rocks, low-grade stockpiles, tailings, and metallurgical residues. The same for target materials. If it was the previously mined mineral, intended as the one for primary mining, or non-previously mined minerals, so new commodities, or either new materials, mix of minerals that could be used as is. And also the maturity level, if it was a research work, a prospect study, or an operating plant. Concerning resource assessment for the 3 stages, we considered parameters to be addressed for characterization, the modifying factors for the evaluation phase, and the classification standard adopted. So this was to standardize the review. Concerning the stakeholder perspective, we tried to list the potential funding bodies, so public agencies, European Union, industries, private companies, etc. The objective, which could be mineral or material recovery, either than land recovery or environmental remediation, or multiple objectives altogether, and the target audience, so the research community, the market, shareholders, finance, and industries, or the public administration. Some results from a spatial point of view, the geographical distribution of the case studies. As you can see, we were able to collect 60 case studies worldwide, 20% of which were related to sites located in Europe. Concerning the stakeholder perspective, the main objective of these case studies was mineral recovery, 90% of case studies analyzed. Among these case studies focusing on mineral recovery, 7.5% was also linked to environmental remediation and 3% linked to land recovery. So here we see that mineral recovery is a driver for environmental remediation or land recovery, but this could be improved. The target audience, of course, was for almost all the case studies, the market, and the public administrations accounted only for 13.6%. Concerning the general data, the mostly addressed raw material source was tailings. So I mean, 80% of case studies only dealt with tailings valorization only, but there were other case studies in which tailings as well as waste rocks or metallurgical residues were considered altogether. Of course, this means that if you are looking only to tailings, into tailings and the previously mined mineral, a huge volume of residues will still remain in the facilities. Concerning the target material, as anticipated, 84% of case studies addressed minerals that were previously mined, so the main commodity, and 26% of case studies also addressed what we could call current commodities, so minerals that weren't previously mined because they were considered not of relevance at that time. In this review, we define new materials as the waste valuable as is, without the need to separate the minerals from the mix. Resource assessment, we found that only 36% of these case studies had a complete characterization according to the parameters that we considered. And concerning the evaluation, we have to say that most of the case studies only have been partially addressing all the modifying factors. The mostly neglected ones are socio-political acceptance and environmental impact, but I think it's worth to say that also market acceptance needs to be better addressed. Classification. We didn't find any case study providing a classification according to UNFC or to PERC, but we know there are some case studies from research works which use the UNFC. And Vitor Correa and Michael Newman also tested CRIRSCO to UNFC conversion on a selection of these 66 case studies. What did we learn from this evidence review? Of course, that mining metallurgical residues are still widely unexplored or not classified, although in the last 10-15 years, many efforts have been put in exploration. Social and environmental impacts mostly needs to be better addressed. And the proposed systematic analysis may be the basis of a more effective decision support tool for raw materials supply risk assessment. Of course, this could be also a useful knowledge base and list of case studies for the UN RMS. Future works. As I told you, one of the achievements of the working group was a collection of about 90 research projects and initiatives dealing with many aspects of primary and secondary resources valorization. This is an ongoing work and we will try to complete this review as soon as possible. And we will publish the case study review and the projects review in a couple of scientific journals. I would also like to launch a call for expansion of interest. Of course, calling the wider expert community to increase the number of case studies analyzed, to supporting the conversion from CRIRSCO to UNFC numbers for the collected case studies, and also to apply UNFC to the relevant number of case studies which have not being classified at all. The benefits, of course, would be an increased awareness of the UNFC potential. The challenges and benefits of UNFC would be highlighted, and we would also improve the knowledge on domestic resources availability. Thank you very much.
Большое спасибо, Карло. И мы переходим к следующему докладчику. Это Рудольф Суппес, инженер проекта компании CBM. Доклад о применениях рамочной классификации ООН, UNECE, в проекте, связанном с отвалами. Это, мне кажется, должно быть тоже очень интересно. Рудольф, пожалуйста, вы готовы?
Да, спасибо вам.
Спасибо. По-русски.
Да. Yeah, can everybody hear me? Yeah, I think so.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure to present the application of the UNFC to tailings. Before I jump right into the case study, let me quickly show you what we did. The goal was to test the applicability of the UNFC to tailings. We did so with the case study on a scoping study level for a private mining company perspective. And the research question, which I'm going to answer in the end, is how does RISCO and UNFC rate the same case study? For the case study, we adopted the assessment classification approach of Müller et al., which begins with a definition of a project, the characterization of a material, which we needed for the later material flow analysis. We then evaluated the development status of the case study with the discounted cash flow analysis in combination with the sensitivity and uncertainty analysis. And in the end, we categorized and classified the case study. So this is our tailings storage facility, or TSF in short. It's called Cabeça do Piau, and it's part of the Panasqueira mining operation in Portugal. The TSF was decommissioned in 1996 due to economic reasons. And out of the 1.9 million cubic meters of volume, we have around 0.7 million cubic meters of tailings. The rest is coarse aggregates from drilling and blasting. The most interesting raw material is tungsten, which is a critical raw material in the European Union. It appears mainly in the form of ferberite, and we have a tungsten grade of 0.28% tungsten trioxide equivalent. Now, it's also interesting to note that we have almost 30% of pyrite and arsenopyrite each, which is quite a lot. The TSF is poorly reclaimed, obviously. On the bottom right side, you can see an example of a slippage zone where even some sort of construction materials are sliding downwards towards the river. On the top right side, there's an example of acid mine drainage, which is directly discharged into the river. Depending on the season, there is up to 600 cubic meters per hour, which are discharged. And the TSF also contributes to the contamination of soils in the area. And medical studies could show that heavy metals such as arsenic, for example, could be found in the bodies of local population. So for the case study, we constructed 3 scenarios. In the first scenario, scenario 0, the TSF is rehabilitated while preserving the raw material potential for future generations. In scenario number 1, we're producing ferberite and sphalerite concentrates, thus converting almost 1% of tailings to commodities. In scenario number 2, we're adding chalcopyrite and pyrite to the commodities, thus increasing the conversion rate to 21%. The tailings are mined in a surface mining operation. We then assumed that the old processing plant on site will be reactivated. They're being processed, and then they leave the system boundaries to be either sold or disposed of. For the economics, no surprise, rehabilitation will generate costs only. When we look at the right side of the slide, we see the economics of the first and second scenario. Here we see that both are economically viable with net present values of almost 40 and 60 million euros. Tungsten is our main economic driver, generating 93 and 70% of the net present value. The sensitivity analysis shows that a tungsten price drop of 55% and 90% will lead to negative net present value, which is a problem because when you look at the historical tungsten price, you can see that it periodically drops by 50%. And so in the case of scenario number 1, this would make it almost unviable. But luckily, the net present value is quite insensitive to other price and cost variations. When we're differentiating the scenarios from an economic point of view, and then looking at Srisco and UNECE perspectives, we see that the rehabilitation is not seen as an interesting scenario for the Srisco, even though we're preserving the raw material potential. Scenarios 1 and 2, of course, due to the economic viability and highly relevant elements, they're regarded as viable options. S2 is even preferred because of higher returns and low operational risks, since we're producing more minerals to spread the commercial risk. But the picture changes when we look at all 3 scenarios and when we see the externalities due to current and continued emissions in the future. And when this is our baseline to say there is a necessity to act, then only the UNECE is seeing the reduction of externalities as project driving factors. Then when we differentiate the 3 scenarios from the UNECE perspective only with respect to sustainability aspects, then obviously the health and environmental protection are key driving factors which legitimize all 3 scenarios. Scenario 1 and 2, they have the benefit if a private mining company were to engage in the project, that we would reduce externalities since we don't have to rehabilitate anymore. For that, you need to know that the TSF is currently owned by the municipality. So in the end, it's the taxpayer who would have to come up for rehabilitation. And scenario 2 is preferred even more. There's actually a bunch of reasons for it. 2 things I would like to highlight is, first of all, we're producing more commodities, hence we have less residues. So this saves our storage space, or in other words, we have less land consumption in the end. And on the other hand, since chalcopyrite and pyrite tend to create acid mine drainage under the right circumstances, and we're removing them from the residues, we have less potential aftercare issues in the end. Yeah, to sum everything up, what we did was to demonstrate the UNECE's applicability to tailings, answering the research questions. When it comes to the prioritization of the scenarios due to sustainability aspects, we can see that the rehabilitation scenario is disregarded by the Srisco simply because it's not economic. Scenario 1, of course, here to the health and social impacts and environmental impacts, we are adding economic viability. So here the Srisco jumps in and says, yes, this is an interesting case study for me as well. And in scenario number 2, again, if we only focus on environmental and social benefits, which are increased, then only the UNECE sees these driving factors. Lastly, I would like to mention some limitations which we found within the current UNECE concept, which made it quite difficult to go through the case study. First of all, even though we were able to clearly differentiate the scenarios with the application of the UNECE principles, it was not possible to categorize them accordingly. So we would end up with a situation that scenario number 1 and 2 would end up in the same category, meaning that the current UNECE concept is not able to, let's say, reward sustainability aspects in the categorization. And the last point is that we were missing a frame to guide us through the case study. To give you one example for the economic assessment, the Srisco template will tell you that you have an accuracy range of plus minus 50%, and it gives you even a plus minus 30% allowance for contingency. And this is something you need to work with because otherwise you don't know what to expect from your case study. And yeah, we would like to see some stronger guidance, I would say, in the future. Yeah, thank you all very much. I'll be happy to receive some questions later.
Спасибо. Спасибо большое, Рудольф. У нас, мне кажется, идет отличная, великолепная дискуссия в чате. Прошу, значит, продолжать эту дискуссию. И следующий доклад у нас по предварительному рассмотрению и оценках проектов, связанных с горными отвалами. И делает его Сарая Хойс Асбихлер, профессор университета Людвига Максимилиана из Мюнхена. Сарая, вы готовы к презентации?
Yes, do you hear me and see my screen?
Yes, sure. Thank you.
Thank you. So you just heard about how a tailings project can be evaluated and classified using UNECE. But most of you may think about how to recognize the potential for mining residues when studies are not available. And that was the point for our studies. Of course, Of course, we can start with the geological exploration and by reconnaissance, prospection, general and detailed exploration, while with each phase the technical effort increases. And then to continue also parallel with a techno-economic approach, which is if it makes economic sense. But there are differences. In contrast to mining projects, the location and the minerals to be expected are known because the tailings are generally in nearby the mining site. And mostly historical data are available and also maybe new information which can be used. Major difference of mining projects are environmental, social, and legal aspects which need to be considered, presumably from the beginning. And therefore, a comprehensive understanding of the potentials and barriers for the development of a raw material project are required. So we wanted to know if it's possible to develop a systematic screening approach only based on the information which are easily available. And our target was to have a screening approach which should be quick, efficient, and compliant with UNFC for a pre-selection of potential resources. We propose 5 steps, ending with the decision whether the mining residues can be considered as a potential resource, and if not, it can be considered as an inventory for the future. And I will present these 5 steps briefly by applying it on a case study. Here you see the case, the tailings storage facility of Bollrich, which is near to the city of Goslar in the center of Germany. And it belongs to the mine Rammelsberg, which was closed 1988 after more than 1,000 years of mining activities. The first step is to gather basic information. Based on the composition of the mined ores, a geological evidence for barite, copper, lead, zinc, and also silver, gold, and indium is assumed because of the documented changes on the ore processing during the operation of the mine, variations in the mineral quantity, quality, and also the distribution in the tailings storage facility can be expected. Infrastructure in form of different types of public roads is present, which is represented in the different colors, colored lines. And the red line you see here surrounding the tailings place, it's a railway path which is not used at the moment. Step 2 is about the precondition factors. And you see the enlarged section of the picture. which shows the buildings, transportation, and utility for infrastructure near the tailings. So there is obviously a chance to reactivate them. The next step is about the environment of the TSF Bollrich. And here you see in light green the protected landscape areas. You see on the right side in the red color, the nature conservation area. And the blue lines show the rivers in the surrounding of the tailing storage facility. In addition to the two cities, Goslar on the left and Oker on the right side of the TSF, we have industrial and commercial areas highlighted in yellow, and also sports activity in the immediate vicinity of these tailings storage facility, which are shown in purple color. There is also another aspect to be considered, that is risk assessment. Due to the geographic situation, a failure of the dam would cause a flow of all water directly towards the town of Oker, and that is only distance is about 440 meters. So that is one aspect which also has to be considered. The human activity in this area is quite high, with the human footprint index of 60 to 80%. And interesting are also the circulating considerations of the Goslar city administration to use this area for local creation. So that was information which can be considered just from the beginning. The next step is about the local stakeholder assessment. You see here that based on this description, that the TSF is located in a complex environment. As on the one hand, we have we see that it's close to agricultural, industrial, and commercial areas. And on the other hand, it is close to forest, nature, and water protection zones, which are also areas for recreation. In consequence, at least 17 different groups were identified. And here I want also to point to a specific feature that the Rammelsberg mine and the town of Goslar are UNESCO cultural heritage sites. So activities around these TSF will be in focus if something will start there. Activities will start there. And something which has to be considered too, that it's not always possible to retrieve information, as for example, about the owner of the TSF. So in this context, a comprehensive stakeholder management is recommended if the project is to be continued. The next step, step 5, is about the UNFC compliant categorization. Concerning the G-axis, it is assumed that the critical raw materials, barite, and the economically highly important metals are present, and also that the TSF volume is sufficiently large so that it can be economically viable. The regulatory factors seem to be the infrastructure conditions seem to be favorable, and also the regulation conditions seem also to be in a way that it wouldn't cause problems. Related to the E-axis, following driving factors have been identified. So that is the reduction of the environmental risk as potentials, benefits of environmental rehabilitation, and the potential to reduce land use related social tension. So in consequence, the project was categorized as prospective project E3, F3, G4, which is the blue box in the diagram of the of UNFC. To conclude, the systematic approach shows that with the readily available information, it is possible to identify potentials and barriers for the development of the recovery project. The case study illustrates that in addition to the legal aspects, both sustainability as well as the interests of the stakeholders, especially that of the local population, have to be considered right from the beginning. The study shows that the screening approach compliant with the UNFC is possible. However, to make the potentials and barriers transparent, it is necessary to show the economic, environmental, social, and also legal aspects separately on the e-axis. With regard to the comparability of the project, potential projects, we see that there is a need for guidance for rating data quality and also for the uncertainty ranges. So that is the way we think how we could start, and we are of course very interested to know what you think about that. Thank you for your listening.
Спасибо большое, Сарая. Это был очень интересный доклад. И у нас последний доклад опять от Карла Кормиа. И я приглашаю Карла. Вы готовы?
Yes, I'm ready. Thank you. So I will be as fast as possible in introducing this upscaling project proposal called AREAS, Advanced Resource Exploration and Assessment Solutions. First of all, for those who don't know, the EIT Raw Materials is one of the several European innovation communities, which is focused on developing raw materials into a major strength for Europe. Every year, they launch a call for project called KIC Value Added Activities. So they fund projects related to education, regional innovation schemes, and upscaling projects, which is the focus of our proposal. AREAS addresses the lack of a service tool for assessing and communicating the viability of material recovery from mining and metallurgical residues. So it's somehow in line with the UNRMS. Aim of the project is to create integrated resource exploration and assessment solution. So we mean software, devices, and services to turn these stored residues into measured resources. So to tackle all the knowledge gaps we illustrated before. Another aim is to introduce a standardized UNFC-based approach and decision support tool to allow for the integration of multidisciplinary datasets and assessment methods. Objectives are to provide innovative solutions in order to map the potential supply of secondary raw materials from EU stocks and wastes in particular, exploit the European Union Earth observation data for exploration and identification of residues, provide a comprehensive and easy to use decision support and control tool for mining and metallurgical operations, and unlock the raw materials recovery potentials of mining and metallurgical residues. Of course, we also aim at reducing the environmental impact of waste generated by such activities. The approach is briefly described in this flow sheet. So the idea is to address the market demand, which are the specification of the raw materials demanded. Then we need to analyze the processing, so how the raw material will be obtained from the resource. So we need to know the specifications for the materials feeding the processing plant, whatever it is. And then we can start with the identification of the potential resource. To do this, of course, we need to characterize an available resource. We need to evaluate the feasibility of the recovery project addressing all the modifying factors. and then classify it according to UNFC standard or CRISCO ones. Once we have all this information, we can build up a digital twin, let's say an n-dimensional model, including temporal, spatial, and parametric information about the resource. And this is in support of resource exploitation. Moreover, this digital twin allows us to optimize the management of residues, which in turn will be represented by this digital twin, and we will avoid the need to characterize or collect information again. Once we know everything about the newly created residues, we can go back to the market demand and then address the need for other raw materials that could be supplied with this potential resource. Again, we pass through processing and we update the resource assessment to check whether the resource can be really exploited. So the approach is, of course, circular. Which are the expected outputs? We expect to create an innovative and highly specialized resource exploration and assessment service, a resource assessment and asset management software, technological solution for resource mapping using, in particular, spectral imaging based approaches. And of course, we would like to provide the training programs to students and professionals. The expected impacts are to improve the knowledge on the availability of raw materials in the European Union countries, to improve industrial symbiosis, in particular in disadvantaged areas, to reduce the dependency from import of raw materials from non-EU countries, the consumption of land and soil, greenhouse gases emissions, environmental impacts, as well as reducing the costs related to storage facilities management, which can have a very long time duration, reduce environmental compensation fees, and in particular, reduce investment risk. Partners of the Consortium for Areas proposal are the National Research Council of Italy, Serengeo, which is the company to which I belong, Fondazione Bruno Kessler from Northern Italy, Ferrari University, World Sensing, which is a Spanish company dealing with IoT technologies, Leiden University, an industrial company which will provide the demonstration site, and Vito Research Center from Flanders. Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое, Карла. И у нас закончились все выступления, но, к сожалению, времени у нас на обсуждение нет, поэтому хорошо, что мы в чате задавали вопросы, и мне кажется, очень активный чат был. Я хочу сказать спасибо и всем выступающим за прекрасные доклады, и всем, кто участвовал в обсуждении этих докладов. А сейчас, мне кажется, Хари, я попрошу, да, вот уже вывел, значит, проекты решения. Я прошу их посмотреть.
Igor,
Да, David?
Yeah, Igor, excuse me. May I make one intervention here, please? If I could. I would like to thank Igor.
Конечно.
Thank you very much, Igor, for chairing the session. Very well done. It was very interesting, and thank all of the speakers as well. We've had a couple of questions that have come through on the purpose of the UNRMS, and some people are a little bit confused on the scope of what exactly the UNRMS is going to cover. And I just wanted to take just a couple of seconds, perhaps, to explain what our view is on the UNRMS, and perhaps hopefully clarify some issues here. So one confusion is what's the relationship of the UNRMS to the UNFC. Well, the UNFC is a system of project classification and presentation of the associated quantities of a resource associated with each project. It accounts in its classification for as project maturity, as well as for the social, economic, environmental, and financial considerations of that project. It's truly unique amongst resource classification systems in this aspect, and we believe it brings great value to the stakeholders in understanding the projects being evaluated. However, it's really only one piece of the considerations that need to be made when we are trying to make the choices of which projects to progress. Stakeholders need a management system around these projects that provide this additional data, again, in a consistent manner as provided by the UNFC. The UNRMS will provide this additional information as well as more guidance on key issues such as competency and quality measures in the estimates. And of particular importance, I think, is also in how to work on education of communities on the impact of different project choices. And I particularly refer to Tatiana Clouthier of Mexico's discussion from a couple days ago. The UNRMS will have a project classification component, and it clearly will be based very closely on the UNFC to describe the readiness and maturity of a project. However, additionally, it's going to capture these additional measures that stakeholders need to make decisions. And these other measures could include data such as greenhouse gas emissions, amount of flaring, number of indigenous community jobs created, the length of a project is going to take to understand the time frame of impacts, a broad number of other issues. The quantity of a resource is only the start in deciding which projects to take forward. We need to look at both the benefits and the potential detriments of any project to make sure we're making the right decision. We've used the term tool rather loosely and in a very generic sense. And when we do that, we don't specifically necessarily mean a digital tool or something like that. UNRMS is going to be an instrument in a very broad sense for the management of resources to help us attain the 2030 agenda. And the UNRMS, I believe, is going to be the framework to help us gather this data in a consistent manner, and one that